The plan to prove what's real versus AI generated online. I'm Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic, and let's dive in. Now, we're going to start with a primer by James O'Donnell of MIT Technology Review that brought this to light. And if you didn't know, Microsoft has just put forward a blueprint for how to essentially prove what is real online. And honestly, I think this is actually really interesting. Now, an AI safety research team at Microsoft recently evaluated how methods for documenting digital manipulation are faring against today's obviously most troubling AI developments. So we're talking interactive deepfakes, widely accessible, insanely realistic models, and on and on. Microsoft then recommended technical standards that can be adopted by AI companies and social media platforms as well. So to really grasp what Microsoft is trying to do, I actually really like the analogy that James O'Donnell of MIT Technology Review, who I'm cribbing from, wrote, and I quote him directly. Imagine you have a Rembrandt painting and you are trying to document its authenticity. You might describe its provenance with a detailed manifest of where the painting came from and all the times it changed hands. You might apply a watermark that would be invisible to humans, but readable by a machine. And you could digitally scan the painting and generate a mathematical signature like a fingerprint based on brush strokes. If you showed the piece at a museum, a skeptical visitor could then examine those proofs to verify that it's an original, end quote. And yeah, that's essentially what we're talking about here. All of these methods, for the record, are already being used to various degrees in the effort to essentially vet content online. And Microsoft evaluated 60 different combinations of them, modeling how each setup would hold up under different failure scenarios specifically. So from metadata being stripped to content being slightly altered or straight up deliberately manipulated. The team then mapped which combinations produce basically solid results that platforms can confidently show to people online, and also which ones are so unreliable that they may cause more confusion rather than actual clarification for the average, let's say, non-technical user. Microsoft's chief scientific officer, Eric Horvitz, said that the work was prompted by California's AI Transparency Act, which is due to come online and take effect this August. He also noted that the speed with which AI has developed to combine voice and video with striking fidelity was also an impetus for Microsoft to get basically off their haunches and do this. So I think this is actually a great step forward, but we need standards and practices. And so I see some issues here with this approach. So being in cybersecurity, I wanted to think through the possible gaps in Microsoft's novel concept here, but also how they might solve them. And so with that, let's start with the gaps that I could think of off the top of my head. At the moment, there's no single reliable technical solution that exists. Microsoft's own report actually underscores that no individual method reliably distinguishes real from AI-generated content across essentially all contexts. All options like watermarks, et cetera, have limitations, and environments where they could fail or even be spoofed actually exist. And so this is a huge issue. Also, not everybody's going to get on board with this. I mean, adoption and compliance are voluntary for Microsoft's approach, and thus it becomes fragmented, right? It's an uphill battle. So think about it this way. Standards like provenance and watermarking only work if widely adopted platforms, publishers, and tool makers actually use them and adhere to that process. There's currently no enforceable mechanism compelling global social platforms like the Facebooks of the world or AI providers like the OpenAIs of the world or publishers in general to comply with this. And on top of that, verification can possibly be manipulated by bad actors. Techniques such as embedded provenance or watermarks can be tampered with or even removed, especially by sophisticated actors that deliberately evade detection. So what I'm talking about here is bad actors can essentially game the verification system. And I understand Microsoft is attempting to layer all of this in, but how many art historians have been fooled by fake Rembrandts or Van Gogh or, any one, of those artists over the centuries? And that's essentially what we are talking about here. It's a cat and mouse game, especially when we are talking about, let's say, cryptographic signatures, watermarking, all those kinds of things. And finally, the public's general understanding of this problem is currently pretty weak, right? I mean, how many people do we see fall for AI something or anything? Not to mention UX problems, the actual interface problems that Microsoft could potentially have here. Even if technical signals do exist, the average user just lacks the literacy to interpret them correctly. And on top of that, a poorly designed verification UI could confuse or mislead non-technical users rather than actually help them discern truth from what's fake. That's a big thing. And so with that, those are the gaps that I could kind of think of, as I'm just making notes on this. So let's try to help Microsoft out here, because I do think overarchingly that somebody's got to try it, and Microsoft's big enough to have an honest to God shot here. And so here are my thoughts on actually filling the gaps that I just mentioned. First, we have to mandate and standardize adoption across all platforms. Governments, regulators, industry consortia, all of that should basically adopt binding rules requiring major platforms and AI providers to embed standardized content provenance metadata and basically make sure that they are doing this end to end. It's got to be end to end as it's being developed and then published. And I know that's going to be a tough sell. I mean, think about China, Russia, etc. They're not going to get on board with this. But if the pressure is on the Facebooks of the world, to actually police this under, and I think it should be criminal penalties, I think it could get better, because Facebook has never really been held to account. I just did a recent segment on Mark Zuckerberg testifying and the questions I would actually ask him, and reading through some of the questions that was actually asked. I'm glad some of the questions the lawyers asked, but he's never really been held to account. And a $5 billion fine is a slap on the wrist for a Facebook. But putting Mark Zuckerberg in jail, which is where I think he belongs, that's going to get him to move, right? On top of it, and this is my next point, I think we need to layer multiple verification indicators together. So instead of relying on just one method like watermarks, provenance, etc., we should build hybrid verification frameworks that combine things like cryptographic provenance, semantic analysis, reputation scoring, and more. Right now, that's going to help to reduce a single point of failure. It's going to be much harder to spoof. And to be fair, Microsoft understands this already, but they need to make sure that basically there is no any kind of weakened fallback authentication method here as well. So think about multi-factor authentication when you log into Microsoft. If you don't have your good hardened authenticator app or a hardware token, you can say, oh, I don't have that there, and then it'll send you a text message, which is vastly weaker per NIST standards than actual good anti-phishing or phishing resistant MFA. We can't have that here when we are talking about essentially identifying what is real versus what is fake. There can be no fallback. All these checks have to match or it isn't real. And I think that's an important one. We also need to invest in user education. We need to develop intuitive visual indicators and essentially generate user education campaigns so that the verified/unverified content labels are actually meaningful. Meaning, if you're a driver, let's say, wherever you're driving, you have a driver's license, every driver in the United States or Canada or North America knows what a stop sign looks like, right? We are trained on that. We see that. And if we don't know what it is, we're going to get into an accident, So having that kind of training is important. Public understanding is essential for trust systems like this to actually influence behavior, meaning they're going to look at this logically, they're going to see that something is missing, or they're going to see that the label's not there, and they're going to know it's fake. This is so unbelievably important, and you can do this at a national level. Finland, granted much smaller than the United States, Canada, etc., they were able to do this in their election before the pandemic to basically thwart disinformation from Russian intelligence. It can be done. The Finns did it. I think everybody else can too. And finally, I think this needs independent oversight and auditing. This can't just be Microsoft, right? Microsoft and regulators should establish a third-party audit system, also transparency reports for verification implementations. In other words, making sure that the OpenAIs, Anthropics, etc. of the world are actually adhering to this, as are the Facebooks. Now, in my mind, this would be similar to like a security audit. It would ensure that platforms and tool makers are basically complying effectively. And so hopefully it would expose weak implementations or adversarial exploitations. That's part of a security controls audit, is to find the gaps, is to understand, oh, you've got a firewall, but you didn't license it. You didn't turn on the threat detection. So all it's doing is routing traffic. You're missing a huge gap, but you have a firewall. That's essentially what I'm talking about. And for the record, there is no easy fix to the situation that we find ourselves in. It's only going to get worse, and it's to the point where it's warping reality. We all probably know somebody that has seen just an enormous amount of disinformation, AI-generated fakes, and believes it to their core, and it's hard to convince them otherwise. This is a huge problem, and it's only getting worse as AI improves on itself. And so we have to do something. And so I support Microsoft's efforts. Let me be clear. I think it's great, even if it is seriously an uphill battle. And so Microsoft, best of luck to you. I'm rooting for you. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP, where hopefully there will be verification systems. Same with YouTube, where you should subscribe. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, 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 I'm going to say private, informed, and secure. Take care.